A man buys a piece of land in Colorado, and on his first night, he hears knocking from beneath the floor. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks. Then a voice, barely a whisper. Please. Water. What he finds under that cellar will drag him back into the darkness he spent 2 years trying to escape, and force him to choose between the killer he was and the man he's desperate to become. Welcome to Wild West Stories channel, where the dust never settles, the frontier never forgives, and every story carries the raw heartbeat of the Old West. Love, revenge, redemption, and the untamed spirit of cowboys and outlaws. This is where those stories come alive. This story reminds us that true courage isn't the absence of a dark past. It's the daily choice to build something better from the wreckage. And sometimes the person you save ends up saving you right back. If this story stirred something in your soul, hit that like button and drop a comment. Tell me, would you have opened that cellar door? Share this with someone who loves a great Western tale, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next ride. The frontier is waiting.
The man who sold him the land forgot to mention the body. Not a human body, not exactly, though Caleb Hart would find one of those soon enough. The body in question belonged to a wolf. A big timber wolf, gray and silver, dried to leather and bone, inside the only horse stall that still had 4 walls standing. The animal had gotten in through a gap in the siding sometime during the previous winter, and then could not get out. It had clawed the wood down to raw grain, trying to escape. Deep grooves in the pine, desperate and systematic, running in parallel lines from floor to the height of a man's chest. The wolf had fought hard. The wolf had lost. Caleb stood in the doorway of the stall and looked at what remained. Ribs like the fingers of a hand reaching out of old hide. Empty eye sockets aimed at the gap in the wall, at freedom, at the sky it never reached. He had seen worse. He had caused worse. But something about the image sat heavy in his gut as he turned away and walked back out into the October wind. Colorado was trying to kill him already, and he had only been here 6 hours. The trail from Denver had taken 2 days on horseback. The last 12 miles climbed so steep and narrow that his mare, a stubborn buckskin named Belle, refused the path twice, and he had to dismount and lead her along the edge with the valley yawning 500 feet below. The altitude burned his lungs. The wind cut through his wool coat like it was made of paper. And the land, when he finally reached it, looked nothing like the advertisement the real estate agent had painted with such generous language back in his warm Denver office. Property of great potential, the man had said. What Caleb saw was 30 acres of rocky meadow climbing toward mountains that rose like broken teeth against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. A ranch house that leaned to the west as if tired of standing upright. A roof collapsed on the south side, a barn door hanging by a single hinge, fences that were more gap than rail, and the dead wolf in the stall, which the advertisement had not mentioned at all. But it was his? Bought with 3 years of wages saved from breaking horses on ranches that worked him dawn to dark, and asked no questions about the scar on his face or the ghosts in his eyes, the kind of places where men arrived with one name and left, if they lived, with another. Caleb Hart was not the name his mother gave him. That name, the real one, was buried in Kansas along with everything else he was trying to forget. He was 26 years old and looked older. The frontier had a way of adding years to a man's face while stealing them from his future. His hands were scarred from rope and leather, and one other thing he did not like to think about. A knife scar ran from his left temple to his jawline, a souvenir from a saloon brawl in Dodge City that had started over a card game and ended with 2 men on the floor, and Caleb walking out into the rain with blood running down his neck, and the certain knowledge that he needed to stop living this way or it would stop him. He wore no sidearm. That was deliberate. The Colt Peacemaker rode at the bottom of his saddlebag, wrapped in oilcloth like something shameful. 23 months since he had last touched it. The longest stretch of his adult life. He spent the afternoon hauling his few possessions inside. A trunk of clothes, his bedroll, a rifle for hunting because a man had to eat. A few books his mother had pressed into his hands before the consumption took her. Their spines cracked and pages soft from rereading. The essentials of a life that could fit in a single wagon. By the time darkness fell, he had managed to start a fire in the stone fireplace, which was the only part of the house built by someone who actually knew what they were doing. He heated beans in a tin and ate them with a crust of bread that was only slightly stale and called it supper. The fire popped and cracked. The wind howled around the corners of the house. Shadows crawled along the walls like living things. Through the window he could see the neighboring estate. And this was the thing that nagged at him, that had nagged at him since he first rode in that afternoon. The place was enormous. A two-story Victorian painted dark green with wraparound porches and gingerbread trim that looked absurdly delicate against the raw Colorado landscape. Behind it stood a proper barn, a carriage house, and what looked like workers' quarters. The fences were in perfect repair. The grounds were immaculate. Firewood stacked neatly under tarps. Gardens recently tended. Someone lived there. Someone lived. Someone with money and meticulous habits. But every window was dark except one. On the second floor, a single candle moved from window to window, pausing, moving on, pausing again. Someone was awake in that grand house, watching, or searching for something. Caleb told himself it was none of his business. He had not come to Colorado to involve himself in other people's lives. He had come to disappear, to build something quiet and simple and clean on this rough piece of land, and to leave behind the man he used to be. The man with the badge and the gun and the blood on his hands that no amount of soap would wash away. He banked the fire, spread his bedroll on the floor near the warmth, because the bed frame in the single bedroom was broken, and that was a repair for tomorrow. He closed his eyes. Sleep came fast, pulled down by exhaustion. And then at midnight, the tapping. It started soft. So soft he thought at first it was a branch scraping the foundation, or a rat in the walls, or the house settling on its bones the way old houses do. But it was too regular for any of those things. Too deliberate. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks. Coming from below, from underneath the floor. Caleb lay still, his heart hammering against his ribs. He thought about the cellar doors he had found that afternoon behind the house, partially concealed by overgrown scrub, not padlocked, not chained, welded shut from the outside. Iron bars hammered across the seams, the welds still bright enough to be recent. Someone had invested serious effort to ensure that whatever was below those doors stayed below. He had told himself he would deal with it tomorrow. The tapping stopped. Silence. So complete he could hear his own pulse in his ears, and the fire dying in the hearth, and the wind outside carrying the yipping of coyotes in the distant hills. Then, muffled by iron and earth, thin as thread, a voice. Please. Water. For the first time in 23 months, Caleb's hand found the Colt. Elena had counted 47 dawns through a crack the width of her finger. Today, for the first time, she heard footsteps that did not belong to Vernon. She knew Vernon's footsteps the way a rabbit knows the shadow of a hawk. Heavy, deliberate, always approaching from the right side of the cellar doors where the ground was harder, and his boots struck louder. He walked like a man who owned the earth beneath him, which in his mind he did. He owned the earth and the house above it, and everything that lived or died on his property, including her. But these footsteps were different. Lighter, more cautious. Coming from the wrong direction, from the neighboring property, from the ranch house that had stood empty for the better part of a year. And they were accompanied by a sound she did not recognize at first because it had been so long since she had heard anything but her own breathing and the drip of water down the stone walls and the scratch of her own fingernails against rock. Metal on metal. Someone was working on the doors. Elena pressed herself against the far wall and gripped the iron bracket she had pried loose from the door hinge 3 weeks ago. The one Vernon had not noticed when he came to weld the doors shut. It was about 8 inches long, flat on one end, and broken to a rough point on the other. Not a knife, but close enough. She had already decided. The next person who came through that door would bleed. The memories came whether she wanted them or not. They always did down here in the dark. Not in order, not as a story with beginning and middle and end, but in fragments, the way a broken mirror reflects a face, piece by piece, none of them complete. The smell of Vernon's tobacco, sweet, expensive, the kind shipped from Virginia in wooden boxes. He had been smoking when he dragged her down the stairs, his hand on her arm, not rough, not gentle, just firm. The grip of a man moving furniture. She was furniture to him, something to be placed where he wanted it and left there until he decided to move it again. His voice, patient, terrible in its patience. "You will thank me, girl. Someday you will understand." The sound of the lock engaging, a heavy, final sound, like a period at the end of a sentence. Then darkness. 47 days of it. She had not simply waited to die. That was the thing people would never understand if she ever got out, if anyone ever asked. She had fought. 3 times she had tried to escape. The first time she stole the spoon from the plate Vernon brought her. Thin tin, barely strong enough to scoop beans, but she dug at the dirt floor with it every night for a week. Hit bedrock at 6 inches, solid granite. The mountains had roots that went deeper than she could ever reach. The second time she screamed. For 3 days she screamed until her voice broke and bled and tasted like copper in her mouth. She screamed until she could not make sound anymore, until her throat was raw meat. No one came. The ranch house next door was empty. The nearest neighbor beyond that was 2 miles away. Vernon had chosen this cellar for a reason. Sound went down into the earth and stayed there. The third time she pried at the door hinges with the broken iron bracket. Worked at it for 2 weeks, hours every day until the screws began to give. She was close. 2 more days and she would have had it. Then Vernon came for one of his visits, saw the damage, and the next day he brought a blacksmith's tools and welded the doors shut from the outside. No more hinges, no more screws, just iron fused to iron, permanent as bone. After that, she stopped trying to escape, not because she gave up, because she started preparing for something else. She kept the iron bracket. She waited. She told herself that when Vernon came down those stairs again, she would not be waiting on her knees. She would be standing, and she would be holding something sharp. But the footsteps above her now were not Vernon's, and the sound of metal on metal was not a key in a lock. It was a crowbar against welded iron. Someone was trying to break in from outside. The work took a long time. She could hear the strain in it, the grunt of effort, the scrape of the crowbar finding purchase and then slipping. Whoever was up there was strong, but the welds were stronger. Iron screamed against iron, a sound that set her teeth on edge and made the walls vibrate. Then a crack, a groan of metal giving way. Cold air rushed down like water, fresh and sharp and so clean it made her eyes sting. Light, lantern light, golden and warm, spilling down the wooden steps. A man stood at the top, tall, lean, a scar on his face that the lantern light turned into a dark line from temple to jaw. His hands were bleeding from the crowbar, his breath fogged in the cold air. He wore no sidearm, just the crowbar, which he had set down on the steps. Elena did not cry, did not cower. She stood with her back against the far wall, the iron bracket raised, balanced on the balls of her feet. Ready. The man looked at her. She looked at him. 2 people measuring each other in lantern light, each calculating whether the other was a threat. "I am not him," the man said. "Prove it," Elena answered. She did not lower the iron. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back, set the crowbar down, sat on the top step, put his bleeding hands on his knees, and waited. He was letting her decide. Elena stood in the dark for what felt like an hour, but was probably 30 seconds. She looked at his hands. They were shaking slightly, not from the cold, but from the effort of breaking through the doors. They were scarred, working hands. And they were empty. She lowered the iron bracket. Not all the way, but enough. "Who are you?" she said. "Your neighbor," he said. "I bought the ranch next door. My name is Caleb Hart." She climbed the stairs slowly, keeping the wall at her back, keeping the iron in her hand. As she passed him on the steps, her foot broke through a rotted board in the corner of the cellar floor. Beneath it, a hollow space. Something small and hard inside. A tin box. She grabbed it by reflex, shoved it into the pocket of what remained of her dress, and kept climbing. She did not know what was in the box. Not yet. She stepped outside. The cold hit her like a wall. The sky was full of stars, more stars than she remembered existing. She took one long breath. The air tasted like pine and frost and freedom. She did not cry. "I need a horse," she said. "He will be back by morning." "Be back by—" "Where will you go?" Caleb asked. "Away. Anywhere that is not here." But from the direction of the grand Victorian house across the field, a lantern light was moving, bobbing through the darkness, coming closer. Someone had heard the crowbar, and someone was coming. Caleb had not carried a gun in 23 months. That record ended at 3 in the morning on an October night on land he had owned for less than 2 days. The lantern light resolved into two figures, not the man Elena called Vernon. She had told Caleb that much in the breathless minutes between climbing out of the cellar and seeing the light approach. Vernon Hale, her stepfather, the man who had chained her below the earth because she refused to be sold in marriage to a business partner, the man who owned the grand house, the town, and most of the people in it. But these were not Vernon. These were two of his hired guns. Elena knew them on sight, Jake Coulter and Dutch Brennan, night patrol. Vernon kept men on his property the way a king kept soldiers, not to work the land, but to control it. Jake was the one who spoke first. He was the older of the two, maybe 40, with a face like a clenched fist and a gun already drawn. He took in the scene with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done ugly work before and slept well afterward. Broken cellar doors, the girl standing in the moonlight, thin as a ghost, wearing rags, the stranger beside her with bleeding hands and no weapon. "Get back in the hole, girl," Jake said. He said it calmly, the way you might tell a dog to get back in its kennel, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Elena did not move. Caleb stepped between them. He had no gun. No weapon at all except the crowbar leaning against the cellar door frame 10 feet away. But he had something else. Years of training in how to read a man's eyes and know whether he was bluffing or ready to kill. Years of standing in the space between violence and talk, learning how to make talk win. "You do not want to do this," Caleb said. His voice was quiet and steady, the voice of a man who had worn a badge. "Nobody needs to get hurt here." Dutch moved to Jake's left, flanking them. Dutch was younger, nervous. His gun was drawn, but his hand was unsteady. A follower, not a leader, scared enough to be dangerous. Elena did not stand behind Caleb waiting to be saved. She moved while the two men were focused on him, circling wide to the right, keeping low. Her hand found a rock on the ground, smooth, heavy, the size of a man's fist. She threw it at Dutch's lantern. The glass shattered. The flame died. Darkness crashed over them like a wave. In the sudden black, Dutch fired blind. The shot cracked the night open. The bullet punched through the barn wall somewhere behind them, sending splinters singing through the air. Caleb moved on instinct. He closed the distance to Jake in 2 strides and drove the heel of his hand into Jake's wrist. The gun dropped. Jake swung with his free hand, caught Caleb in the jaw hard enough to make his vision swim. Caleb grabbed the fallen revolver, reversed it, and brought the butt down on the back of Jake's skull. Jake went down like a sack of grain. Dutch was scrambling in the dark, trying to reload. Caleb turned the revolver on him. The click of the hammer cocking was the loudest sound in the world. "Easy," Caleb said. "Put it down." Dutch put it down. They tied both men with rope from the barn. Elena did the knots, quick and sure. The knots of someone who had worked with rope her whole life. She checked them twice. Then she took Jake's gun belt and strapped it around her own waist without asking permission or forgiveness. Caleb watched her. His hand was still trembling. Not from the cold, not from the fight. From the moment he had held that revolver and felt how natural it was, how easy, how How the weight of it in his hand felt like coming home to a house he had burned down on purpose. The memory hit him like a fist. A bank in Ellsworth, Kansas. A boy standing in the doorway, 16 years old, holding something that looked like a gun. Caleb, 23 years old and wearing a deputy's badge, making a decision in 1 second that would last the rest of his life. The crack of the shot. The boy folding, the wooden gun carved and painted to look real, skittering across the bank floor like a toy. "You know how to handle a gun," Elena said. She was watching him with those dark eyes that missed nothing. "Why are you pretending you do not?" Caleb did not answer. He picked up both horses that Jake and Dutch had ridden in on and led them toward the barn. "We need to move," he said. Elena looked toward the road that led to Cedar Ridge. "Town is Vernon's territory," she said. "Every road in is watched. Every merchant owes him. Every lawman answers to him. Then where?" She pointed toward the mountains, toward the high country where the peaks were already white with early snow. "Up. He will not follow us into the high country at night. He does not have the stomach for it." They rode. Elena sat her stolen horse like she had been born on one, which she probably had. The moonlight turned the landscape silver and black. The trail climbed fast, switchbacking through pine forest that smelled like cold sap and frozen earth. Behind them, Vernon's estate shrank until it was just another shadow in the valley below. After an hour of climbing in silence, Elena spoke. "Who sold you that ranch?" Caleb told her the name. "Howard Finch, a land agent with an office on Larimer Street in Denver, thin man with spectacles and a handshake like a dead fish." Elena's laugh was short and bitter. "That man works for Vernon. Why do you think the only property next to his was priced so cheap? Vernon controls who lives beside him. You, a man with no family, no connections, no one who would come looking. You were the perfect neighbor. If you saw something, nobody would believe you. If you disappeared, nobody would notice." The words settled into Caleb's gut like stones. He had not stumbled into this. He had been chosen, selected. Vernon had engineered his presence the way a man sets a trap, choosing the ground, placing the bait, making sure the animal walks exactly where you want it to walk. But something else bothered him. Elena knew too much. She knew the agent's connection to Vernon. She knew the roads were watched. She knew how Vernon operated, from the inside. His old instincts fired, the lawman's instincts, the ones he thought he had buried. "You know a lot about how Vernon works," he said carefully. "You knew the agent was his man. You knew the roads are watched. If you knew all that, why did you not warn me the moment I opened that cellar? Or were you part of the arrangement?" The silence that followed was dangerous. Elena's hands tightened on the reins until her knuckles went white. When she spoke, her voice was flat and cold and hurt. "I was chained in a hole for 47 days. Does that feel like an arrangement to you?" Caleb heard the wound in her words and knew he had put it there. She was right. She was absolutely right. And he was doing what he always did, trying to control the situation instead of trusting the person in front of him. "I am sorry," he said. Elena said nothing. She turned her horse up the trail and rode on without looking back. The crack between them was small, a hairline fracture. But it was there. Dawn came slowly, gray to gold, painting the peaks in light while the valley below stayed dark. They stopped at a ridge where the trail widened enough to rest the horses. From here they could see everything. Vernon's estate, a dark shape surrounded by its manicured grounds. Caleb's ranch, small and rough beside it. The town of Cedar Ridge, a scattering of buildings along a single road. The whole world laid out below them like a game board. Then Caleb saw it. 4 riders leaving Vernon's property, not together. Fanning out in 4 directions, north and south and east and west, like points of a compass. Methodical. Professional. Vernon was awake. Vernon was hunting. Caleb looked down at his saddle. The Colt Peacemaker was no longer in his saddlebag. It was on his hip. He did not remember putting it there. Some decisions are not made with the conscious mind. They are made by the body, by instinct, by the part of you that knows what is coming before your brain catches up. He was going to need that gun. The man was afraid of something inside himself more than he was afraid of the 4 gunmen tracking them through the mountains. Elena did not yet know what it was, but she recognized it because she carried something similar in her own chest. October at 10,000 feet was a killer, and it was trying its best. The temperature had dropped below zero some time before dawn. The wind came in gusts that shredded exposed skin and turned sweat to ice on the inside of clothing. Early snow began falling around mid-morning, fine and dry as sand, stinging their faces and erasing their tracks behind them. This was both advantage and liability. The riders below would have trouble following, but Caleb and Elena would have trouble surviving. Elena's body was failing. 47 days in the cellar had destroyed her reserves. She had eaten barely enough to keep her heart beating. Her muscles had atrophied. Her bones ached in the cold with a deep, grinding pain that made every step a negotiation between will and collapse. She stumbled on a rock, caught herself on the horse's mane, stumbled again on a root, caught herself again. She did not ask for help. She did not admit weakness. She would have crawled on her hands and knees before she asked anyone for anything. That was what Vernon had taught her, not through kindness, but through cruelty. If you depended on people, they owned you. If they owned you, they could put you in a cellar. Caleb saw. He said nothing. He took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders without comment, without looking at her, as if it were the most casual thing in the world. Just a man adjusting his load. Elena took it without thanks. Neither of them acknowledged what had just happened. They pushed higher through pine forest that thinned as the altitude climbed. The trees grew shorter, more twisted, bent by decades of wind into shapes that looked like old men reaching for something they would never touch. The trail narrowed to a game path, and then to nothing at all, just rock and scrub and the sound of their own breathing, harsh and labored in the thin air. In the late afternoon, when Elena was fairly certain she could not go another step without falling, a voice came from behind a rock outcropping. "You two are either the bravest or the dumbest people in this territory, and I have not decided which." The man who stepped out was maybe 60 years old, maybe older. It was hard to tell. The mountains had weathered him the way they weathered everything, stripping away the unnecessary and leaving behind something hard and essential. He was thin as a fence rail. His face was brown leather stretched over sharp bones. He held a jug of corn whiskey in one hand and a Sharps rifle in the other, and he was grinning like he had just heard the best joke of his life. "Name is Jim Bridger," he said. "People around here call me Coyote, on account of I am hard to get rid of and I eat things most people would not touch." He took a pull from the jug and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "I have been watching you two since dawn. You ride like people who are running from something with teeth." Caleb's hand went to the Colt on his hip. Jim saw it and laughed. "Easy, son. If I wanted you dead, you would have been dead 6 hours ago. I hit a running elk at 400 yards with this Sharps last spring. A man on horseback at 200 would be a disappointment." He gestured up the trail with the jug. "I have a cabin about a half-mile up. Fire, food, 4 walls, and a roof. You look like you could use all 4. "What do you want in return?" Caleb asked. Jim grinned wider. "Nothing in this world is free, son. I need timber hauled down to my woodshed before winter locks in proper. 3 days of work. Good hard labor for a good hard roof over your head. Fair trade." "We do not have 3 days," Elena said. Her voice was hoarse. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from the cold. Jim shrugged with the elaborate indifference of a man who had all the time in the world. "Then freeze. Makes no difference to me." They followed him up the trail. Jim's cabin was small but solid, built into the lee side of a granite outcropping that sheltered it from the worst of the wind. Log walls chinked tight with mud and moss. A stone chimney that drew clean. A single room with a plank floor, a wood stove, a bed made of pine branches and blankets, and shelves lined with canned goods and ammunition and books that surprised Caleb. Shakespeare? Emerson? A Bible with a cracked spine. Jim built up the fire in the stove until the cabin was warm enough to make their frozen clothes steam. He heated canned stew and served it in tin cups and watched Elena eat with the quiet attention of a man who recognized starvation when he saw it. "How long?" he asked. Not nosy, just factual. Elena looked up from the stew. 47 days. Jim whistled low through his teeth. He looked at Caleb. "You the one who got her out?" Caleb nodded. "Then you are either a hero or a fool, and in my experience, those are the same thing." He took another pull from his jug. "Vernon Hale is going to want both of you dead. You know that." "I know that," Caleb said. "Good, long as we are clear on the stakes." Jim settled into his chair and stretched his legs toward the stove. "Now, you want to know what I know about Vernon Hale, and I want my timber hauled. So let us get to work." The 3 days passed in a rhythm that Elena did not expect. Labor, rest, information. Caleb hauled pine logs down the mountain trail from dawn until his hands bled, the same hands that had bled breaking through the cellar doors. Elena insisted on helping despite Caleb's protests, which she ignored with the calm efficiency of someone who had stopped listening to men tell her what she could and could not do a long time ago. She braided rope faster than Caleb. He watched her hands move, quick and certain, and realized she had done heavy work her entire life. Work she was never paid for. Work that had calloused her palms and strengthened her grip and taught her that survival was a skill you practiced every day, or you lost it. Caleb repaired a section of Jim's cabin roof that had started leaking. He worked with the precision of a man who found peace in fixing broken things, measuring twice, cutting once, fitting each shingle into place with care that bordered on tenderness. Elena watched him and understood something about him she could not yet put into words. He was a man who needed to repair things, not just buildings, everything. One evening, exhaustion won. Elena fell asleep sitting up beside the stove, her head tilting slowly until it rested against the log wall. She woke sometime later to find a blanket draped over her shoulders and Caleb sitting by the door with the rifle across his knees, keeping watch. She said nothing, but she did not remove the blanket. On the second morning, she found a wildflower growing from a crack in the rock beside the cabin. Yellow, small, stubborn, blooming in October at 10,000 feet, where nothing had any business blooming. She touched it with one finger, did not pick it, just touched it and moved on. Jim delivered his intelligence in pieces, spread across the 3 days like a man dealing cards. "Vernon has 4 guns on his payroll," Jim said on the first evening. "Not 2, 4. Jake Coulter and Dutch Brennan, who you already met. Plus Garrett Slade, who is mean but not smart, and a man they call Preacher Pete Macklin. He got the name because he recites scripture before he kills. Real pleasant fellow." On the second evening, while Caleb was splitting kindling outside, Jim told him about the sheriff. "Coleman is not just bought," Jim said quietly. "Vernon holds something on him, something personal. 5 years back, Coleman got drunk and beat a prisoner to death in his own jail. Man named Harkins, a drifter nobody cared about. Coleman sobered up and panicked, and Vernon helped him cover it. Now, Coleman does what Vernon says because Vernon can put him in the territorial prison anytime he wants." And on the third evening, the worst of it. Jim was staring into the stove, his eyes reflecting the fire, his voice different now, lower, careful. "There is a woman in town named Rosa Delgado, used to cook for Vernon. Mexican lady, been here 30 years. She knows things about that house that would curl your hair. But she is afraid. Vernon would kill her if she talked, and she knows it." "What kind of things?" Caleb asked. Jim looked at Elena, who was sitting on the floor wrapping rope, her hands moving automatically while her ears caught every word. "Ask Rosa about how the girl's mother died," Jim said. "Rosa brewed the tea every morning. She knows what was in it." Elena's hands stopped moving. The rope went tight between her fingers, tight enough that the fibers cut into her palm, and a thin line of blood appeared. She did not flinch. She did not look up. Caleb saw the blood and understood. This was no longer just about imprisonment. This was about murder. Jim had one more piece. He delivered it on the third morning while they were loading the last of the timber onto the sledge. Vernon hired Pinkerton men, Jim said. I saw one of them at the post office last week, asking questions, showing a photograph. He looked at Caleb with eyes that were suddenly not drunk at all. Whatever name you left behind, son, Vernon is going to find it, and when he does, he will use it. The Pinkertons, the most relentless detective agency in the country. If Vernon had hired them to dig into Caleb's past, it was only a matter of time before they found Caleb Morrow, former deputy sheriff of Ellsworth, Kansas, before they found the shooting, before they found the dead boy. Time was running out. That night, sitting by Jim's stove, Elena laid out her plan. She spoke with cold precision, the way you might discuss the purchase of livestock. No emotion. Just tactics. Marry me, she said. On paper. Vernon loses guardianship. I gain legal standing as a married woman. You have a lawful reason to stand between him and me. No love, no romance, just strategy. Caleb stared at her. Not because the idea surprised him, because the way she said it did. Like human connection was a business deal. Like trust was a currency you spent, not a gift you gave. He saw what Vernon had done to her, not just with chains and darkness, but with years of control that had taught her to see every relationship as a transaction. I will agree, Caleb said, but not because it is tactical, because it is right. Right does not keep people alive out here. Smart keeps people alive. Maybe I am tired of being smart at the cost of being decent. In the corner, Jim pretended to sleep, but Caleb caught the grin behind the whiskey jug. They descended toward Cedar Ridge the next morning, the trail winding down through pine and aspen that had turned gold and were now dropping their leaves in the cold. The valley opened below them, beautiful and dangerous. Elena rode beside Caleb in silence for a long time. Then she spoke, and her voice was quiet and steady, and carried the weight of a promise. If Vernon killed my mother, she said, I will kill him. Not a threat, a plan. Caleb looked at her and saw that she was completely serious. Her eyes were dark and certain. Her hand rested on the gun belt she had taken from Jake Coulter, and her grip was easy and familiar. He understood then that this war could end in two ways. It could end with Vernon in jail or in the ground, but it could also end by turning Elena into a killer. And he knew from personal experience exactly what that cost. The price was not paid once. It was paid every night, in dreams, in mirrors, in the moment between sleeping and waking when the past reached up and grabbed you by the throat. He could not let that happen to her. He could not save her from Vernon and lose her to the same darkness that had consumed him. Elena had never imagined wearing a wedding dress. When the moment came, she wore a stranger's shirt, stood in a dark church at 2 a.m, and tried not to think about how quickly the iron bracket hidden in her boot could open a man's throat. Cedar Ridge was quiet, the kind of quiet that frontier towns achieved only in the deepest part of night, when even the drunks had passed out and the dogs had stopped barking, and the only sounds were the wind and the creak of wooden signs swinging on their chains. Caleb and Elena slipped in from the mountain trail on foot, leaving the horses tied in a stand of cottonwood a quarter-mile from town. They moved through back alleys and empty lots, keeping to shadows, listening for hoofbeats. Through the gaps between buildings, Elena could see lantern light moving on the main road. Vernon's men, patrolling. Even at 2 a.m, even when the man they served was sleeping in his grand house, the machine of his control kept turning. The church stood at the edge of town. White-clapboard, plain-glass windows, a cross mounted above the door. Reverend Elijah Matthews opened the back door before they knocked. Jim Bridger had sent word ahead by means he would not explain. Matthews was a surprise. A black man in his 50s with silver threading through his hair and eyes that held both kindness and iron. A former runaway slave who had built himself a life in a church through sheer force of will. He understood captivity in his bones. He was also the only man in Cedar Ridge who had refused to do business with Vernon Hale long before Elena's imprisonment. He looked at them both for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Come in, quick. Inside, the church smelled like candle wax and old wood and something else, something that might have been prayer if prayer had a scent. Matthews closed the door and barred it. Through the windows, Elena could see the lantern light still moving on the main road. Close, too close. Matthews did not make it easy. He took Elena into his small office and closed the door, leaving Caleb outside. 15 minutes. Just the two of them. "Do you want this?" Matthews asked. His voice was gentle, but his eyes were not playing. "Or are you being pushed into it?" "I want this," Elena said. "No one is pushing me." "But do not tell me this is about love. This is about survival." Matthews studied her face. He had the look of a man who had seen enough of the world to know that survival and love were not as different as people like to believe. "Sometimes survival is the first form of love," he said quietly. "Loving yourself enough to fight." Elena did not answer. She did not know what to do with kindness that came without strings attached. Vernon had taught her that everything had a price. That gentleness was just cruelty with a mask on. She was 19 years old, and she could not remember the last time someone had been kind to her, without wanting something in return. Until Caleb. She pushed the thought away. This was not about feelings. This was about law, about papers and signatures and the cold machinery of legal protection. "I am ready," she said. The ceremony was short. Matthews spoke the words by candlelight while his wife, a kind-faced woman named Ruth, and Jim Bridger stood as witnesses. Jim was drunk but upright, which Elena suspected was his permanent condition. Outside, the lantern light of Vernon's patrol passed the church windows and moved on. The words were spoken in near silence, just above a whisper, as if they were praying. When Matthews reached the part about kissing, both Elena and Caleb hesitated. A long, awkward pause that stretched until Jim coughed meaningfully. Elena turned her cheek. Caleb's lips brushed it lightly. Not romance, but his skin was warm against hers, and something moved in her chest that she did not have a name for. Hands. His scarred fingers next to her calloused ones on the marriage certificate. Two damaged hands making a legal promise. She signed her name. Elena Valdez. He signed his. Caleb Hart. Matthews signed. Ruth signed. Jim signed with a flourish that splattered ink. It was done. Elena Valdez was now Elena Hart. Vernon Hale's legal guardianship ended the moment the ink dried. After the ceremony, Matthews led them through the dark streets to a room behind the Chinese laundry on 2nd Street. Not a laundry anymore. The woman who ran it, Mrs. Sullivan, had converted the back into a boarding room that she rented to people who needed to not be seen. Rosa Delgado was waiting. She was old. Older than Elena remembered. Her hair was completely white now, pulled back in a bun. Her hands, clasped in her lap, were trembling. When she saw Elena, her face crumbled. "You look just like her," Rosa whispered. "God help me. You look just like your mother." Elena sat down across from her. Caleb stayed by the door, close enough to hear, far enough to give them space. This was not his conversation. "Did Vernon kill my mother?" Elena asked. She asked it directly. No preamble, no softening. She had spent 47 days in darkness with this question growing inside her like a second heartbeat. She was done waiting for answers. Rosa's silence lasted a long time, long enough to become its own answer. Then she spoke. "I do not know for certain, but I know she was healthy until Vernon found out she was writing letters to someone in Mexico, arranging to take you away. After that, she started getting sick, gradually. Like something was eating her from the inside. Vernon told me to brew a new herbal tea for her every morning, said it was good for her health, good for the baby she was not carrying. I brewed it every morning, and she got weaker and weaker. Rosa was crying now, silent tears tracking down her lined face. I did not know. I swear before God, I did not know until it was too late. By then she was gone, and I was too afraid and too ashamed to speak." Elena felt something inside her rearranging, not breaking. She had broken already, down in the dark. This was something else. Pieces falling into a pattern she had always suspected but never confirmed. Rosa continued, unprompted. Her voice shook, but she did not stop. He had a daughter once, his own blood, little girl named Sarah. She died of scarlet fever when she was 6. His first wife could not bear the grief. She left him. After that, something broke in Vernon. He could not stand losing anyone again. When your mother tried to leave, he saw it happening all over. The daughter gone, the wife gone, everything slipping through his fingers. I think he believed if he could not keep people by love, he would keep them by force. And if force did not work, she could not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Elena sat very still. This was the thing about monsters. They were not born, they were made. Grief and loss and rage hammering a man into something unrecognizable, the way a blacksmith hammers iron into a blade. Understanding this did not make Vernon less terrible. It made him more so, because it meant anyone could become what he was, given enough loss, given enough darkness. Your mother hid something in that cellar, Rosa said. A letter she was writing when Vernon caught her. She shoved it somewhere before he dragged her upstairs. If it is still there? Elena's hand went to her pocket. The tin box, the one she had grabbed from the hollow beneath the rotted board. Now she knew what it was. She looked at Caleb, who stood by the door with his arms crossed and his face carefully blank. He nodded slightly. Go. Elena stepped outside, behind the building, alone. And she broke, not dramatically, not with screaming or wailing or any of the performances grief sometimes demands. She slid down the wall and sat in the dirt and pressed her hands against her mouth and cried, silently. The way you cry when you have spent years believing you were abandoned, believing your mother left you behind because you were not worth staying for, and then learning in a single night that she died trying to come back for you. Her mother had not abandoned her. Her mother had been murdered for trying to save her. Rosa came out, said nothing, sat beside her in the dark. An old woman and a young one, side by side in the dirt behind a laundry in a town that did not care about either of them. Mourning together the woman they had both failed and both loved. No dialogue. No, just presence. The wind carrying the smell of wood smoke and frost, the stars turning slowly overhead. Caleb was not in this scene. It did not belong to him. Later, 4 in the morning, the sky still dark, the cold deepening toward dawn. Elena opened the tin box under the light of Rosa's single candle. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of cloth gone stiff with age, was a letter, written in Spanish. The ink blurred by water, tears or spilled liquid, most of it illegible. But the handwriting was her mother's. Elena knew it the way she knew the sound of her own heartbeat. And the final line, the handwriting shaking, barely legible but there, pressed into the paper with the desperate force of a woman who knew she was dying. He is poisoning me. I know it now. If I die, come for Elena. Do not leave her with him. The letter stopped there. Ink smeared where the page was shoved into hiding. The last words of a dying woman reaching across years of darkness to find her daughter. Elena folded the letter, very carefully, very slowly, like it might crumble to dust if she handled it roughly. She placed it back in the tin box and closed the lid and pressed it against her chest. When she looked up at Caleb, who had been waiting outside the door, something in her eyes had changed permanently. Not grief, certainty. Caleb knew what it felt like to be hunted. He had once been the hunter. The distance between the two, he was learning, was smaller than he thought. Word traveled fast in small towns, especially words that threatened powerful men. By noon, the day after the wedding, Vernon Hale knew. The county clerk had talked. Or perhaps the lawyer Garrison, whom Vernon kept on retainer in Denver for exactly this kind of situation. Or perhaps one of the townspeople who had seen Caleb and Elena riding through the streets at dawn, the girl wearing a man's shirt and a gun belt and a look on her face that said she was done being afraid. However Vernon found out, his response was not legal. Not this time. At midnight, 2 nights after the wedding, Caleb woke to the smell of smoke, not wood smoke from the hearth. This was different, sharper, hotter, the smell of a building catching fire. He was on his feet before his eyes were fully open, pulling on boots, grabbing the rifle. Through the window he could see it. The barn where the horses were stabled, the barn he had spent 2 days repairing, flames climbing the dry timber walls with terrible speed, the wood almost exploding in the thin, dry mountain air. Fire at altitude behaved differently than fire in the lowlands. It was hungrier, it moved faster, it consumed the horses. Caleb ran. The heat hit him 20 feet from the barn door, a wall of it, pushing back against his chest. He could hear the animals screaming inside, high-pitched and wild with terror. He wrapped his coat around his face and plunged through the doorway. Inside was hell, flames running across the ceiling like living things, smoke so thick he could not see his own hands. He found Belle by sound, her hooves pounding against the stall door, and threw the latch open. She bolted past him, mane smoking. He found the second horse, one of the animals they had taken from Jake and Dutch, and dragged it out by the halter while embers rained down on his hands and the skin of his palms blistered and popped. He staggered out into the cold air, gasping, his hands screaming with pain. The barn was fully engulfed now, a tower of flame against the black sky, sparks rising like orange stars. A rifle shot cracked the night, not aimed at him, aimed at the 2 figures retreating on horseback toward Vernon's property. Elena stood on the porch of the ranch house, the rifle at her shoulder, working the lever for a second shot. She fired again. One of the riders, Garrett Slade, from the way he sat his horse, jerked and clutched his arm. His horse veered hard. He kept riding, but he was hit. The other rider did not flee. Preacher Pete Macklin pulled his horse around and came back, slow, deliberate, like a man who had been hoping for exactly this. He dismounted 50 yards from the porch. The fire painted him in orange and shadow. He was not tall, but he was broad, built solid as a stump, with a face that held no expression at all. He wore a long coat that he pushed back to clear his holster. His hand rested on the grip of his pistol with the easy patience of a man who had done this before. "Well now," Pete said. His voice was gravelly, calm, almost friendly. "Heard you used to be the law. Heard you shot a kid in Ellsworth." What was he, 15, 16? Holding a toy gun, and you put a real bullet through his chest. Elena was on the porch, the rifle still raised, but Caleb saw her face change. The fragile trust she had been building, brick by slow brick, over late-night conversations and shared labor, and the quiet intimacy of 2 people learning each other's rhythms, shattered in an instant. She did not lower the rifle, but her eyes shifted, and for a moment, just a moment, the iron bracket she always carried, the one from the cellar, appeared in her left hand. And it was not pointed at Pete. Vernon's Pinkertons had delivered. Vernon had found Caleb Morrow. Pete was still talking. His hand had not moved from his pistol grip. He was enjoying this, the way a cat enjoys a mouse, taking his time. "What kind of lawman shoots a boy holding a stick?" Pete said. "The kind who runs away and changes his name. The kind who marries a girl half his age in the middle of the night. Makes a man wonder what else he is running from." Caleb stood in the dirt yard between the burning barn and Preacher Pete. His hands were burned and blistered. His heart was hammering. And the old darkness was rising in him, the thing he had tried to bury in Kansas, the thing that made him afraid of his own shadow. He reached for the Colt, not to shoot Pete. He drew and fired in one motion, putting the bullet through the lead rope of Pete's horse. The animal screamed and bolted, dragging Pete sideways. Pete stumbled, went to one knee. Caleb closed the distance in 3 strides, kicked Pete's gun away, and put the Colt's muzzle against Pete's forehead. "Tell Vernon," Caleb said. His voice was steady, cold, the voice of a man who had worn a badge. "Next time he sends someone, do not bother sending them back." Pete looked up at him and smiled, the smile of a man who had just learned something useful about his enemy. Then he got up, collected his horse, and rode away into the darkness. The barn burned itself out. There was nothing to save. The horses were safe, standing wild-eyed and trembling in the yard. But the building was gone, just charcoal and embers, and the smell of ash and ruin. Elena sat on the porch step, the rifle across her knees, the firelight dying on her face. She did not look at Caleb when he approached. "You killed a child," she said. Caleb stopped. The words hit harder than Pete's bullet would have, because they were true. He was 16, he said, holding something that looked like a gun, in the middle of a robbery. "I had 1 second to decide, and you decided wrong. Yes, and I have lived with it every single day since." The fire popped and settled. Somewhere in the hills, a coyote called to its pack. The wind carried the smell of burnt wood and the cold promise of snow. "Why did you not tell me?" Elena said. "Because I was afraid you would look at me exactly the way you are looking at me right now." She did not forgive him. She took a blanket and walked to the porch and wrapped it around her shoulders and settled against the post with her back to him. Choosing distance, choosing the cold over his company. Caleb did not stop her. And this was the first time he realized that he did not try to control the situation, did not argue, did not explain, did not make it about himself. He let her have her anger, let her have her distance, let her decide. He went inside and sat by the fire and waited. But waiting was not enough. The shame was too big, the old darkness too strong. Around midnight, while Elena slept on the porch wrapped in her blanket, Caleb loaded the colt, saddled the remaining horse, and rode toward Vernon's estate. Not to talk, not to negotiate, to end it. The old way, the lawman's way, or the killer's way. He was no longer sure which one he was. He got within 200 yards of Vernon's dark house, dismounted, walked through the frost with the colt in his hand, his breath fogged. His heart was steady, and that steadiness terrified him, because it meant the killer in him was not gone. It had just been sleeping. The house loomed above him, dark and silent. He thought about walking up those porch steps, finding the door, finding Vernon in his bed, ending this with a single bullet. It would be so easy, so clean. The world would be better without Vernon Hale, and nobody would mourn him. And Elena would be safe, and Caleb would be exactly the monster he was afraid of becoming. Then he saw it. Across the valley, through the bare trees, a single light in his own ranch house. Elena's window. She had lit the lantern. She was awake. She was still there. Despite everything she had learned tonight. Despite the dead boy in Ellsworth. Despite the lies of omission and the shattered trust. She had not left. Caleb stood in Vernon's yard for a long moment, the colt in his hand, the light in the window across the valley, the choice between the darkness he had always feared, and the fragile possibility that he could still be something other than what his worst moment had made him. He holstered the colt, turned the shie, walked back to his horse, rode home. Elena was sitting on the porch when he returned. She saw the colt on his hip, saw the direction he came from. She knew. "I almost did the stupidest thing I have ever done," Caleb said. "Almost does not count," Elena said. Then, after a pause, "But it scares me that you went. It scares me too." Silence. The fire inside the house was dying. The stars were fading toward dawn. Morning came. Elena was still there. She stood with her back to him, looking out at the valley where Vernon's house sat, dark and waiting. "I have not forgiven you," she said, "but I still need you, and you still need me. So we keep going, but no more secrets." "None. None," Caleb said. She turned around. Her eyes were red but dry. She held up her mother's letter, the one from the tin box, the one written in shaking handwriting by a woman who knew she was being poisoned. "Vernon killed my mother," Elena said, This is proof, and I'm going to use it to destroy him. Through the law or with my own hands? Are you with me or in my way?" "With you," Caleb said. "But if you kill him, you lose yourself. Trust me, I know what that costs." Elena looked at him for a long time. And for the first time since Pete's revelation, something in her expression softened. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the possibility of it, distant and small, like a light in a window across a dark valley. There were 3 ways to bring a powerful man to his knees. Take his money. Take his reputation. Take his freedom. Caleb intended to do all 3 in 48 hours. He did not have a plan for what would happen if he failed. The territorial circuit judge, Thornton, was arriving in Cedar Ridge for his quarterly session. He would be in town for exactly 2 days. 2 days to hear cases, settle disputes, and administer what passed for justice in a territory that was not yet a state. If Caleb and Elena missed this window, the next circuit was 3 months away. By then, Vernon would have destroyed all evidence, consolidated his power, and made damn sure Elena never saw the inside of a courtroom. 48 hours, starting now. Caleb divided the work the way a general divides an army. 3 fronts, 3 battles. All of them had to be won. He found Edgar Thorne at the Cedar Ridge Hotel, a 2-story wooden building with pretensions of grandeur that amounted to curtains in the windows and a spittoon in the lobby. Thorne was eating breakfast alone. He was a heavy man in his 50s, prosperous-looking, with the soft hands of someone who made money by moving it rather than earning it. Mining investments, railroad speculation, the kind of wealth that grew in boardrooms and banks while other men broke their backs underground. Thorne looked up when Caleb sat down across from him uninvited. "I do not believe we have met," Thorne said. "We have not. But we have a mutual acquaintance, Vernon Hale." Thorne's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully the way a man sets down a weapon. "I do not know what Vernon told you, but I'm not involved in whatever dispute you're having with him." "He did not tell me anything," Caleb said. "Elena did. She told me about the dinners, about being dressed up and displayed like livestock for your inspection, about the $50,000 investment Vernon wanted in exchange for her hand in marriage." Thorne's face went the color of old tallow. "Keep your voice down." "She told me about Vernon describing her as healthy stock, about you asking whether she was docile, about Vernon assuring you she was biddable. That is a gross mischaracterization of a business discussion." "Is it? Because I have a woman who will testify under oath to exactly what I just described. And I have the name of a judge who arrives in town tomorrow." Thorne pushed back from the table. His eyes were calculating, the eyes of a man who always looked for the exit before entering a room. "Even if what you say is true, and I'm not admitting that it is, testifying against Vernon Hale would be financial suicide. He has connections throughout the territory. Business partners, political allies. I would be ruined." Caleb placed a folder on the table. Inside were documents Jim Bridger had provided, shipping manifests, freight records, numbers that did not add up, evidence that Thorne had been systematically evading territorial taxes on his mining operations for the better part of 3 years. "You can testify against Vernon," Caleb said quietly, "or I can send these to the territorial tax assessor. Pick your enemy." Thorne stared at the documents. His face went through several colors. "You are blackmailing me. I am giving you a chance to do the right thing with the right motivation. Sometimes people need both." The silence stretched. Thorne picked up his fork, put it down again, looked at the documents, looked at Caleb. Elena was waiting outside. She had heard everything through the thin hotel walls. When Caleb emerged, she looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. "You are not as clean as you pretend," she said. "I never said I was clean. I said I try to do the right thing. Sometimes right looks ugly." She nodded. Not approval exactly, more like recognition. She understood ugly. She had lived it. Elena found Margaret Winters at a boarding house on Maple Street. Margaret was a woman in her 30s, thin from too many meals skipped so her children could eat, with the nervous eyes of someone who had spent years looking over her shoulder. She had worked in Vernon's house. She had seen things. She had quit and run and tried to forget. Elena did not beg. She did not plead. She sat across from Margaret at a small table in a small room and made a transaction. $200, Elena said. She placed the money on the table. Every dollar Caleb had left. For your testimony. Enough to take your children to California and start over. Margaret looked at the money, her eyes filled with tears, not of gratitude, of shame. You should not have to pay for the truth, Margaret said. I should not have to do a lot of things, Elena said. But here we are. You have children who need to eat. I have a man who needs to be stopped. This is how the world works for women like us. Margaret took the money. They did not hug. They shook hands. A deal between equals, sealed in a boarding house room that smelled like old wood and lamp oil. When Caleb discovered that Elena had spent their last dollar without telling him, the argument was short and sharp and cut both ways. You used our money without asking, he said. Our money, Elena said. Her voice was dangerously quiet. You want to control the purse the way Vernon controlled everything else. Caleb went silent. She was right, not entirely, but enough that he could not argue. And the fact that she compared him to Vernon, even for a moment, hit harder than he wanted to admit. The third front was the hardest. Caleb met Sheriff Coleman behind the livery stable at dusk. Coleman was a thick-bodied man in his 40s with a mustache that drooped past his jowls and eyes that held 20 years of compromise and regret. He smelled like whiskey, which Caleb suspected was his default condition. Caleb did not threaten him, did not bluff, did not play games. I know Vernon holds something over you, Caleb said. I do not care what it is. I care about whether you want to spend the rest of your life under his boot. Coleman stared at him. His jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. I have evidence that Vernon murdered his wife, Caleb continued. Slow poison. When that evidence reaches Judge Thornton, Vernon falls. And every secret he holds loses its power. You can stand on either side of that line. But only one side has a future. Coleman said nothing. His hand rested on his gun belt, not threatening, just habitual. The gesture of a man who had carried a weapon so long it was part of his body. Caleb left. That night, alone in his office, Coleman opened his desk drawer and pulled out the whiskey bottle that lived there. His companion, his crutch, his chain. He looked at it for a long time, the amber liquid catching the lamplight. Then he pulled the cork and turned the bottle upside down and poured it onto the wooden floor, where it spread in a dark stain and soaked into the grain. Preparing to be sober for what came next. An hour before midnight, Elena smelled smoke again. Not the barn this time. This smoke came from the direction of town, a glow on the horizon that pulsed orange against the dark sky. She knew before she could see. Vernon was attacking the evidence. The church, where the marriage certificate was filed, where the legal record of her freedom was stored in a metal box in Reverend Matthew's office. She ran. Caleb was behind her, but she was faster, fueled by desperation and the absolute certainty that if that certificate burned, Vernon would argue the marriage never happened, and she would be dragged back into the dark. The church was burning. The back wall was fully engulfed, flames climbing the white clapboard like hands reaching for the steeple. People were emerging from nearby houses, carrying buckets, shouting, organizing the kind of desperate, futile resistance that small towns mounted against fire. Elena did not join the bucket line. She went in through the front door, which was not yet burning. The smoke inside was thick enough to taste, hot enough to sear her lungs. She could see nothing. She dropped to her hands and knees and crawled, following the wall, counting doorways until she found the office. The metal box was on the shelf where Matthews kept it. She grabbed it, clutched it against her chest, and turned back toward the door. A ceiling beam cracked above her. She rolled sideways as it came down, missing her by inches, showering sparks across her back and arms. She crawled through the doorway, through the nave, through the front entrance, staggered down the steps and collapsed on the ground, coughing smoke, her hair singed, her hands blistered and bleeding. Caleb reached her, grabbed her shoulders. His face was white. "Are you insane?" he said. "The certificate was in there," Elena said. "Without it, we have nothing." She opened the box with shaking, burned hands. The marriage certificate was inside, slightly scorched at the edges, but intact, legible, legal. Proof that Elena Valdez was Elena Hart and that Vernon Hale had no claim on her. She held it up, her burned hands holding the proof of her freedom. Reverend Matthews stood in the street watching his church burn. The building he had built with his own hands, board by board, nail by nail, over the course of 5 years. His face held grief and iron in equal measure. "He can burn the building," Matthews said quietly. "He cannot burn what was spoken before God." That night, back at the ranch house, Elena sat by the fire while Caleb wrapped her burned hands in clean cloth. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The smell of smoke clung to everything, their clothes, their hair, the air itself. Then Elena reached for Caleb's hand. Not because she needed bandaging, not because she was afraid. She reached for his hand because she chose to. The first time she had initiated contact not from necessity but from something else. Something she still did not have a name for. They sat like that. Two burned hands holding each other in the firelight. No words. Outside at the tree line, Vernon Hale stood watching. Alone. No hired guns. His hand rested on the revolver at his hip. He watched the lamplight in the window. He watched the two shadows moving behind the glass. Then he turned and walked away. Not tonight, but soon. The last time Caleb stood before a judge, he was the defendant. This time he was the plaintiff. The feeling he discovered was not significantly different. Judge Thornton arrived in Cedar Ridge at 9 in the morning on a Thursday, riding in a buckboard driven by his clerk, a young man who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. Thornton was gray-haired, grave, and had the reputation of a man who followed the law the way a mule follows a road, without deviation and without enthusiasm. He was not interested in stories or emotions or pleas for mercy. He was interested in evidence. The hearing was held in the room above the general store, the only space in Cedar Ridge large enough to accommodate a legal proceeding. It was packed before Thornton even sat down, standing room only. The entire town had turned out, drawn by gossip and the promise of a reckoning. Vernon sat at the front with Garrison, his Denver lawyer. Garrison was expensive, and it showed. Tailored suit, polished boots, the careful grooming of a man who understood that appearance was its own argument. Beside Garrison sat two character witnesses Vernon had brought from Denver. Businessmen who would testify that Vernon was generous, civic-minded, and deeply concerned about his troubled stepdaughter. Vernon himself was composed, controlled. He wore his respectability like armor, and his expression was the face of a man bearing an unfair burden with dignity and grace. Caleb looked at him across the room and felt a cold anger that had nothing to do with passion and everything to do with clarity. He was seeing Vernon clearly for the first time. Not a monster. Something worse. A man who believed absolutely in his own righteousness, who had convinced himself that everything he had done, the control, the imprisonment, the murder, was justified by his need to keep his world intact. The hearing began. Garrison was very good. Caleb had expected competence. What he got was performance. Garrison did not simply defend Vernon, he attacked. He produced the Pinkerton report, read it into the record with the precise diction of a man driving nails. The individual known as Caleb Hart is in fact Caleb Morrow, former deputy sheriff of Ellsworth, Kansas. On March 14, 1880, Deputy Morrow shot and killed a 16-year-old boy named Thomas Birch during an attempted bank robbery. The boy was carrying a wooden replica of a pistol carved and painted to resemble a Colt revolver. Deputy Morrow was acquitted by a jury but subsequently resigned his position, abandoned his legal name, and fled across 2 territories. Garrison paused. Let the words settle into the room like dust. This is the man who claims to be protecting Elena Mercer, a man who kills children and runs from the consequences, a man so ashamed of his own history that he buried it under a false name, a man who, by his own admission, arrived in this town with nothing, married a minor within days of meeting her, and now seeks to prevent a responsible guardian from exercising his lawful duties. The room shifted. Caleb could feel it, the way you feel weather changing, a pressure drop, a cooling. The sympathy that had been building toward Elena was draining away, replaced by suspicion and unease. People were looking at him differently, a child killer, a fraud, a man with something to hide. "Your Honor," Garrison continued, "Mr. Hale is not the villain in this story. He is a grieving stepfather who did everything in his power to protect a troubled young woman from her own destructive impulses. The cellar that Mrs. Hart describes as a prison was in fact a secured storage area for valuable goods. The so-called forced marriage arrangement with Mr. Thorne was nothing more than a guardian, exploring suitable matches for his ward. And the marriage to Mr. Hart, obtained in the dead of night without proper counsel or parental consent, was a clear case of a vulnerable minor being manipulated by a man with a documented history of poor judgment and violence. Caleb sat still. The shame was eating through his chest like acid. Every word Garrison spoke was designed to strip away his credibility, to reduce him to the worst moment of his life, and define him by it. And it was working. He could see it in the faces around the room, in the judge's careful, neutral expression, even in Elena, who sat beside him with her burned hands clasped in her lap, who knew the truth and still flinched when she heard the dead boy's name. Then Elena stood up. She did not ask permission, did not wait for Garrison to finish. She stood up and spoke, her voice clear and carrying, cutting across the lawyer's polished rhetoric like a blade through silk. "That man killed a child." The room went silent. Elena looked at Garrison, then at Vernon, then at the judge, then at these. "The lawyer is right. That man killed a child, and that man has lived with the weight of it every day since. So much weight that he gave up his name, gave up his badge, gave up his gun, spent 2 years trying to become someone better, 2 years without touching the weapon that haunts him, because he understood, in his bones, what it means to take a life." She paused. The silence was absolute. "Meanwhile, your client murdered his wife, chained his stepdaughter in a cellar, left her to starve in the dark for 47 days, and slept soundly every single night." She looked at Vernon. He stared back at her, and for the first time his composure flickered. Not guilt. Rage. The rage of a man whose property was talking back. "So I ask this court," Elena said, "who is more frightening? The man haunted by his mistake, or the man who has no mistakes to be haunted by?" Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The words hung in the room like gun smoke after a shot. Garrison opened his mouth, closed it, closed. Opened it again, could not find the comeback. For the first time in what was clearly a long and successful career, he had been outmaneuvered by a 19-year-old girl in a borrowed dress with burned hands. Judge Thornton leaned forward. His expression had not changed, but something in his eyes had sharpened. "The court will hear from the defense witnesses," he said. Edgar Thorne took the stand. He was sweating. His hands were shaking. He looked at Vernon once and then did not look at him again. "Mr. Hale proposed a marriage arrangement for his stepdaughter," Thorne said. His voice was unsteady, but his words were clear. He described her as young, healthy, obedient. He said she was available for the right price. The price was $50,000, structured as an investment in his mining operation. He called it a mutually beneficial alliance. I called it what it was. He was selling her. Garrison attacked Thorne's credibility, called him a jilted business partner, pointed out his tax irregularities. But the damage was done. The word selling sat in the room like a stone. Margaret Winters took the stand next. She described the threats Vernon had made against Elena's mother, the control, the isolation. the herbal tea that Rosa had brewed every morning on Vernon's instructions. Garrison tore into Margaret, pointed out she was a paid witness, called her a disgruntled employee, challenged every detail. Margaret held, but barely. Her voice shook, her hands twisted in her lap. The case was balanced on a knife edge. Thorne's testimony was damning but compromised. Margaret's testimony was emotional but circumstantial. Elena's letter was written in Spanish and unverified. Caleb's credibility was in tatters. And then Coleman stood up. The sheriff had been sitting in the back of the room throughout the hearing, silent, still, invisible in the way that large, quiet men can be invisible when they want to be. He stood up and the room noticed. Everyone noticed, because Coleman was Vernon's man. Everyone knew it. Coleman did Vernon's bidding, enforced Vernon's will, looked the other way when Vernon's interests required looking away. For years, Coleman had been as much a part of Vernon's operation as the hired guns. "Your Honor," Coleman said. His voice was rough, unsteady, the voice of a man who had poured his whiskey on the floor. "I have additional evidence to present." The room went electric. Vernon's composure cracked. Genuine shock flashed across his face before he could control it. Garrison grabbed his arm, whispering urgently, but Vernon shook him off. Coleman walked to the front of the room. He did not look at Vernon. He looked at the judge. "Last night," Coleman said, "I went to Mr. Hale's property and examined the cellar on my own authority, for the first time. In 5 years of serving as sheriff, I never once looked inside." He paused. "I should have." He laid items on the table, a section of heavy chain with fabric caught in the links, fabric that matched the dress Elena had been wearing when Caleb found her, photographs of the cellar walls showing deep scratches, fingernail marks gouged into stone, and a small glass vial containing residue of an herbal compound. "I have looked the other way for too long," Coleman said. "Vernon Hale held something over me, something I did years ago that I am ashamed of. I let that shame make me a coward. I let a man imprison a girl, and I did nothing because I was protecting myself." He took a breath. His hands were steady now, the hands of a man who had made his decision and would not unmake it. "I am done protecting myself. Whatever comes of this, for my career, for my freedom, I would rather face it standing up than spend another day on my knees." Vernon erupted. He stood so fast his chair flew backward. He shoved Garrison aside and pointed at Coleman with a shaking finger. "Traitors, every one of you. She is mine. She belongs to herself." Judge Thornton's voice was ice and iron. The gavel cracked like a gunshot. "Sit down, Mr. Hale, or I will have you restrained." Vernon stood for a long moment. His face cycled through colors, red to white to a mottled purple that looked like something breaking inside him. Then he sat, slowly, like a man whose strings had been cut. Thornton shuffled his papers. The room was silent except for the scratch of the clerk's pen. "This court finds as follows. The marriage between Caleb Hart and Elena Hart, formerly Elena Valdez, is valid under territorial law. Mrs. Hart was competent to consent. There is no evidence of coercion by Mr. Hart. The petition for annulment is denied." Elena's hand found Caleb's under the table. She gripped it so hard he felt the bones shift. "Furthermore," Thornton continued, "based on testimony and physical evidence presented today, Vernon Hale is to be held in the county jail pending investigation into charges of false imprisonment and attempted murder by starvation. The evidence regarding the death of Mrs. Valdez Hale will be referred to the territorial prosecutor for separate investigation. Finally, Sheriff Coleman is relieved of his duties effective immediately pending review of his conduct in office." Coleman nodded. He had expected this. He accepted it the way a man accepts a wound he has been carrying for years, with relief that the thing was finally out in the open. The gavel fell. Court adjourned. Vernon was led out in irons. As he passed Caleb and Elena, the deputies let him pause. He leaned close. His voice was barely above a whisper. "My men are still out there. Garrett and Pete. They have been paid in advance. Whatever happens to me in that jail, they will finish what I started." The deputies pulled him away. Caleb watched him go, and knew with absolute certainty that Vernon meant every word. He looked at Elena. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. The hearing was over. But tonight was not. The distance from the courthouse to the ranch was 4 miles. Somewhere in those 4 miles, Caleb would have to become the man he once feared. They left town in the late afternoon, riding west into a sun that hung low and red above the mountains. The light was the color of old blood. The air smelled like pine and cold stone, and the faint lingering scent of smoke from the church fire that still smoldered on the edge of town. Caleb wore the Colt openly on his hip for the first time since Ellsworth, not hidden, not wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of a saddlebag, on his hip where a lawman wore it, where a killer wore it. The two were not as different as he once believed. Elena carried the rifle across her saddle. The bandages on her burned hands had been changed that morning by Rosa, who had kissed each palm before wrapping them in clean cloth. Elena had not cried. She had closed her eyes for a moment, that was all, and then opened them and picked up the rifle and walked out into the world. They did not speak. The weight of what was coming sat between them like a third rider. Vernon's last words played in Caleb's mind on a loop. "My men are still out there. They have been paid in advance." The road narrowed 2 miles outside town. A canyon where the creek ran close to a rock wall, the water low and clear over smooth stones. Pine trees crowded the ridgeline above. Perfect ambush country. Caleb knew it. He had spent enough years reading terrain to recognize a kill box when he rode into one. He could have taken another route. A longer way around, through open meadow and gentle slopes where a man could see trouble coming from a mile away. But there was no other road home, and he was tired of running. They were halfway through the canyon when the riders appeared, 2 of them, blocking the trail ahead, one on each side of the road, positioned to create a crossfire. Garrett Slade on the left, his right arm in a sling from Elena's rifle shot 2 nights ago, his left hand holding a pistol steady enough. Preacher Pete on the right. Calm, patient, his long coat pushed back to clear his holster, Bible visible in his breast pocket. Pete spoke first. His voice carried in the canyon, echoing off the rock walls. "Vernon paid for 2 bodies, nothing personal." Caleb reacted before the last word faded. He threw himself sideways off the horse, grabbing Elena and pulling her down with him. They hit the ground hard. His burned hands screamed as they scraped across rock. Elena rolled, came up with the rifle, took a knee behind a boulder. Pete fired. The bullet hit the rock wall an inch from Caleb's face. Stone fragments cut his cheek, blood and dust. The sound of the shot bounced between the canyon walls like something trapped. Elena returned fire. 1 shot. Clean. It caught Garrett in the shoulder of his good arm. He dropped his pistol screaming and fell off his horse. The animal bolted, dragging Garrett's boot through the stirrup for 20 yards before he kicked free. Pete did not flinch. He dismounted, drew his revolver, and advanced on foot. Steady, methodical, firing as he came. The bullets cracked against stone around Caleb, each one closer than the last. Caleb drew the Colt. The weight of it in his hand was familiar and terrible. The last time he had fired this gun at a human being, a boy had died. Pete was 20 yards away, 15. He was out of revolver ammunition and switching to a knife, an ivory-handled blade that caught the dying sunlight. Close quarters now. Pete came in fast, slashing. The blade caught Caleb's shoulder, opening a cut that bled freely and burned like a brand. Caleb grabbed Pete's knife hand, twisted, drove his knee into Pete's gut. Pete doubled over. Caleb brought the Colt down on Pete's wrist, and the knife clattered to the stones. Pete stumbled backward, tripped on a root, went down on his back. Elena was there, standing over Pete with the rifle aimed at his chest. Not from a distance, from 6 feet, execution distance. Pete looked up at her. He was not afraid. He was curious, waiting to see what she would do. Elena's finger tightened on the trigger. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes were dry and clear and absolutely certain. She had been carrying this moment since the cellar, since the letter, since the night she sat in the dirt behind Rose's building and cried for a mother who died trying to save her. Pete was Vernon's instrument, the hand that carried out Vernon's cruelty. Vernon was in jail, but Pete was here on the ground, helpless. Close enough. If Vernon killed my mother, I will kill him. Her own words, spoken on a mountain trail. A promise. A plan. She was going to pull the trigger. Caleb saw it, the stillness in her body, the steadiness of her hands, the look in her eyes that he recognized because he had seen it in his own mirror every morning for 2 years, the look of someone about to cross a line they could never uncross. He did not speak, did not say, "Do not do it," did not lecture, did not reason. He walked to her side and placed his hand on the rifle barrel, pushed it down, slowly, gently, not forcing, offering. Elena looked at him, looked at Pete, looked at the rifle in her hands, and she lowered it herself. Her own decision, her own will. Not because killing was wrong in the abstract, because she would not let Vernon's cruelty transform her into someone who killed helpless men on the ground. She had survived the cellar by refusing to become what Vernon wanted her to be. Obedient, broken, his. She would survive this the same way. Pete looked up at her from the ground. His voice shook for the first time. "You should have shot me." "Maybe," Elena said, "but then I would be just like the man who sent you. And I did not survive 47 days in a hole to become him." They tied Garrett and Pete with rope from the saddlebags, left them for the deputies who would follow when they did not check in. The canyon was quiet again, just the creek running over stones and the wind in the pines and the last light of the sun disappearing behind the mountains. Elena bandaged Caleb's shoulder wound. Her hands were steady and warm against his skin. The first time she had touched him without hesitation. "You aimed for his shoulder," she said. "You could have aimed center mass." "Yes." "Why did you not?" "Because I did not want to become someone you would have to be afraid of." Elena looked at him. The man who had killed a boy and spent 2 years running from it. The man who had broken through welded iron to free a stranger. The man who had ridden to Vernon's house with murder in his heart and turned around because he saw her light in the window. She placed her hand flat against his chest, over his heart. She could feel it beating, strong and steady and alive. He placed his hand over hers. They stood like that under the rising moon. Blood on his shoulder, gunpowder in the air, the mountains standing around them like witnesses to something sacred. This was the real vow. Not spoken in a church at 2 a.m. with a drunk frontiersman and a preacher's wife as witnesses. Not written on a piece of paper in a metal box. This vow was made here in the dirt after blood and fire and the worst parts of themselves laid bare. "We saved each other," Elena said quietly. "I think that is what partners do." Spring came to the valley the way forgiveness comes to people who have earned it. Slowly, and from the ground up. The snow melted first from the south-facing slopes, where the sun hit longest. Then from the meadows, then from the creek banks where the water ran brown and fast with snowmelt, carrying winter away in long, cold ribbons that caught the light. The mountains held their white caps longest, but even those were softening at the edges, the peaks going from blinding white to a gentler gray that said the worst was over. 6 months had passed since the hearing. The ranch looked different now. Not grand, not fancy, but whole. The new barn stood where the old one had burned, wider than the original, with double doors that let in light and air. Elena had chosen the design. She wanted doors that opened all the way. She said she had spent enough time in enclosed spaces. 3 horses grazed in the paddock. Belle, the stubborn buckskin who had carried Caleb across the territory. The second horse they had taken from Jake and Dutch on that first desperate night. And a third, a young bay mare delivered without ceremony or note to the ranch gate one morning by a freighter who said only that a gentleman in Denver had paid for her. Thorne's penance, delivered without expectation of thanks. Caleb and Elena accepted it without comment. They were learning that forgiveness was not a single act, but a practice, something you did every day, sometimes grudgingly, sometimes generously, but always deliberately. The cellar was gone. Elena had filled it herself over the course of the winter, one wheelbarrow at a time. Rocks first, hauled from the creek bed, then soil, dug from the meadow where the ground was soft. She had worked alone. Caleb offered to help. She declined. This was something she needed to do with her own hands. When the cellar was full, level with the ground, invisible, she planted marigolds on top. Yellow ones, her mother's flower. The flower that thrived in hard soil, that bloomed in heat and drought, that returned year after year, no matter how many times winter tried to kill it. Rosa lived with them now. She had arrived in January, walking the 4 miles from town with a carpet bag and a cast-iron skillet, and the expression of a woman who had decided something and was not interested in discussing it. She cooked, she tended the garden. And in the afternoons, when the light was long and golden and the wind dropped to a whisper, she sat with Elena on the porch and told her stories about her mother. How she laughed, Rosa said, this big laugh that filled the whole room. Your father, he fell in love with that laugh before he even saw her face. How she braided her hair, 2 long braids that she pinned up for work and let down at night, and they hung past her waist, black as a crow's wing. How she sang while she cooked. Mexican songs, old ones, the words worn smooth by generations of women who sang them over cook fires and washboards and cradles. Elena listened. Sometimes she asked questions. Sometimes she just sat and let the stories wash over her, filling in the years that Vernon had stolen. Vernon died in the county jail 7 weeks after the hearing. Stroke. The doctor said it was sudden, that Vernon had been sitting in his cell reading the newspaper when his body simply stopped, the way a clock stops when the spring winds down. No trial, no dramatic reckoning, no satisfying moment of justice delivered in a courtroom with witnesses and a gavel. Just a man who lost everything. His power, his reputation, his control over the people he had tried to own, and whose body decided it had carried enough. Elena received the news at breakfast. Rosa had come in from the garden with dirt on her hands and a particular stillness in her face. Elena set down her coffee cup, looked out the window at the mountains where the morning light was turning the peaks from shadow to gold. She was quiet for a long time. My mother liked marigolds, she said. That was all. There was no funeral to attend, no grave to visit, no reconciliation with the dead. Vernon had built a life designed to make people fear him, and in the end, the only legacy of that life was its absence. The grand Victorian house stood empty. The grounds he had maintained with such obsessive care grew wild. The cellar where he had kept his stepdaughter was filled with rocks and soil and flowers. The world moved on. On a morning in April, early before the sun cleared the mountains, Elena knelt in the garden where the cellar used to be. The marigolds she had planted last fall had survived the winter. Tough, yellow, stubborn, like something that refused to die. She was planting new ones beside them, her hands deep in the soil, the dirt black and rich under her fingernails. Caleb came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee. He leaned against the post and watched her. Did not speak. The sky was turning from gray to pale gold. The wind carried the smell of wet earth and pine and snowmelt and something else, something green and new, the smell of things growing. Elena looked up, saw him, did not smile, not exactly. But her eyes softened for a moment, the way a landscape softens in the first light of morning. An expression that held everything, grief and survival, fear and courage. The careful, hard-won belief that the world might contain more than cruelty, that kindness might exist without a price tag, that someone might stand beside you in the dark for no reason, except that it was right. She went back to her planting, hands in the dirt, knees on the ground where she was once buried. Caleb drank his coffee and watched his wife plant flowers on the grave of the worst thing that ever happened to her. He thought about the boy in Ellsworth, about the wooden gun skittering across the bank floor, about 23 months of running and hiding and wrapping his weapon in oilcloth like shame. And he thought about the night he heard tapping from beneath the earth and made a choice that changed everything. He had come to Colorado to disappear. Instead, he had been found by a woman who taught him that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. By a community that showed him the difference between isolation and solitude. By a version of himself that he had spent 2 years trying to bury. A man with skills and instincts, and a capacity for violence that could be turned toward protection instead of destruction. He was not redeemed. That word was too clean, too finished, for the messy ongoing work of becoming a decent person. But he was closer than he had been. Closer than he had thought possible on that October night when he rode in with nothing but a deed to land he had never seen, and the bone-deep certainty that his old life was dead. The mountains stood where they had always stood. The valley held what it had always held, the living and the dead, the broken and the mended. The ordinary silence of a world that continued whether anyone was watching or not. The creek ran with snowmelt, the sound of winter ending. In a small ranch house at the edge of Cedar Ridge, 2 people who had found each other in darkness sat down to breakfast and did not talk about the past. They talked about the garden, about the horses, about whether the fence on the north pasture would hold through another season or needed replacing. Small things, ordinary things, the things that make a life when the extraordinary is over, and what remains is the quiet, steady, daily work of living. Elena poured more coffee. Caleb reached across the table and took her hand. Her calloused, dirt-stained, scarred hand in his scarred, burned, working hand. 2 hands that had fought and bled and built and held. They did not let go. Outside, the marigolds turned their faces toward the sun, yellow and stubborn and alive. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.